You're listening to Puma Podcast.
This week, the world pauses to mourn the passing of Pope Francis, who redefined the papacy with his humility, compassion, and unwavering commitment to the poor and marginalized. For millions of Catholics, especially in the Philippines, Pope Francis was more than a spiritual leader. He was a symbol of hope, mercy, and the call to live out the true meaning of faith. In this special conversation, we are joined by Father Albert Alejo of the Society of Jesus, better known as Parang Bert. He's a Jesuit priest, anthropologist, poet, a teacher at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and a passionate voice for social justice. As a fellow Jesuit, Parang Bert offers a unique reflection on the life, legacy, and lasting impact of Pope Francis, and what his passing means for the Church, the Philippines, and for all of us moving forward. Join us as we remember a Pope who chose simplicity over power, service over status, and left us with a challenge to build a more compassionate world. This is Regine Cabato for Teka Teka News, powered by Puma Podcast. Parang Bert, thank you so much for taking the time off to spend with us today. Maybe we can start off with what the mood right now is in Rome and how you found out about the news.
I'm still a bit sleepy because I woke up very early so that I could fall in line very early at 5:30 in time for the 7 a.m. opening of the visit to the remains of Pope Francis. So the mood is, peace. It's not, there's no, there's no habulgol, yung ganon. Hindi naman habulgol. I've seen the death of Lady Diana. Yung ba masyadong emotional? Hindi naman ganon. But there's so many people. I lined up at 5:30 in time for the 7 a.m. And in just 30 minutes, the line became siguro 100 lines. I was on the fifth line. Pero in just 30 minutes, siguro 100 na. 100 na. Tapos in 1 hour, nako, hindi mo na makita talaga. Sobrang haba na. So many people are flocking to see this great man. The remains of this great soul, great leader. And the emotion is a kind of tempered, no? It's not an emotion of coming from just fans. There's a feeling that there's something noble here. Somebody was in our midst, and he was a great soul, and he was a great man. And he introduced silently and some radical changes, not radical, but progressive changes without destroying institution. And there is a hope that much of the reforms would continue. Reform in terms of opening up our minds, our hearts, and expanding our capacity to love, expanding our notion of human dignity, and expanding our notion of spirituality and religiosity, expanding the scope and the ambit of what it means to work in the church, to include different kinds of people, different kinds of religions and culture, and not only that, to include the earth, the wind, the ocean, the mountains. Siguro the next pope will have to include the Milky Way, etc. But for this season, this was a man who has expanded our capacity to love.
And it says a lot, no, Parang Bert, that there are so many people, even people who are not within the community of Catholics, who are coming out and saying all these words about Pope Francis, that he had really expanded, right, our interpretation of dignity, our interpretation of humanity, right? So that comes with a bit of mixed reactions, right, across the political spectrum, which we'll talk about later. But before we do that, let's talk a bit about what Pope Francis means for Filipinos in particular. And a lot of Filipinos will remember him from his 2015 visit. Were you ever able to meet him at that time? And what is your recollection of Pope Francis's interaction with the Philippine Church?
He became Pope in 2013. No, I was in your city, in Zamboanga City, because I transferred. I transferred from my long stay in Davao City, more than 10 years, and then I was transferred to Zamboanga City in 2010. So in 2013, Pope Francis became the global figure, and he came just in time, no? Kasi Mindanao then was at the heart of conflicts, no? And also ecological crisis with so much mining operations, destruction of coral reefs. And here comes a pope saying there is joy in the gospel. And then later on, Laudato Si, that the ecological crisis is a social crisis and a moral and an even a spiritual crisis. Then, uh, 2015, I was transferred to Manila. And here comes the mga, ano naman, yung Fratelli Tutti. Kaya ang ganda eh. But it was unfortunate kasi the Jesuits chose 40 Jesuits who would have a personal encounter with the Pope. I was not part of the 40. But sabi ko na alibay, I'm in sour grapes. Eh sabi naman ni Pope Francis, go to the peripheries. So I remained in the peripheries, no? With the Lumads, the indigenous peoples, and then dialogue with the armed rebels, etc. But his first homily, his first speech, which he made in Malacanang, I think, facing the diplomats and the government officials, was on corruption. Yeah. Sabi niya, reject, fight corruption in all its forms. Meaning, not just corruption in the government, not just corruption in society or in business or in media, but also corruption even in the church. Corruption even in the personal hearts of the individual. So, and that really, I was very empowered by that because during that time, one of my advocacies was really anti-corruption, no? With the Jesuit anti-corruption movement. Sabi ko, "Shoo, hit na hit yun." And so I quoted him in my book, Ejemplo. Ganon. So, personally, talagang sapol na sapol. And looking back, the past 12 years, my main ministry and teaching really just revolved around what he was saying. So, sabi ko, oh nga no, all these past 12 years, I was just echoing through my PowerPoint presentations, etc., what he has been trying to tell the world. Peace, integrity, human dignity, care for the environment, and good governance, and fight for justice. We can talk about that in a while.
Yeah, now that you mentioned it, no, paring Bert, you're right in that he was very consistent with these stances of his. Even care for the environment, his warnings about climate, right? I think it also shows in his visit to Tacloban, his insistence to defy the weather and go visit the people who were so worn out by the typhoon, right? And then when we were back in Manila, I was in the crowd of 6 million, which would come to be the largest mass in history when he it was wild, and honestly, I had a spiritual experience really listening to his homily at the time, speaking to a little girl who was asking him why sex trafficking was still prevalent in society and why God allowed it to happen to young people. And the way that he responded to it was, I think it had no pretension at all. He didn't try to justify anything. He just met this little girl where she was at. And he had a homily about how it was okay to cry and everything. It really felt to me that at the time, the whole country and that crazy crowd, we were all united by one thing, which was hope. And it was even in some ways, and let me know what you think about this, Paring Bert. There was a very liberal kind of idealism at the time that was very pre Duterte. It was inclusive, and because Pope Francis was there was this idea that we could work for a better world and we could bring even the poorest of the poor with us. But then the next year happened, and that vision was, of course, not realized in practicality. And Filipinos would come to elect Rodrigo Duterte in 2016. And then suddenly, this nation was deeply divided and deeply unforgiving of what they viewed to be menaces in society, right? The supposed scum of society. And suddenly, Filipinos were singled out, no? What what do you think Pope Francis would have said about that? And what was his reading? I'm sure we all know that he was aware, no, of what was happening in the Philippines. What was his reading of the Philippines in the years that followed his visit?
Well, there's a lot there, no? Siguro going back to that Yolanda visit, um, he keeps Francis keeps on mentioning a church that goes out, a church that has open doors. Sabi niya, open the doors of the church and receive those from the outside. And then later on, he corrected himself. Sabi niya, wait a minute, correction. Open the doors and the windows and don't just wait for them to come in. Go out. Sinasabi niyang, Chiesa in Ushita. A church that reaches out, that goes forth, that goes out. And he lived that kind of principle. Sabi niya, well, he arrived. Sabi niya, sorry, I arrived late. At sabi ko, okay lang yun. Okay lang, sabi niya. Sabi niya,
Filipino
that, when I heard about what happened in Yolanda, I said, sabi niya, I said, I really have to be there. And he really managed to visit Yolanda people, the victims, and the damage was still there. And this was the only time when he said mass in the middle of a storm, in a rain, yellow raincoat. Wala yung mga paraphernalia ng mga Roman collar, mga ganyan. Nakakapote at nililipad yung kapote niya. Nakakatuwa. Tapos sabi mo nga, hindi ko rin makalimutan yan, umiiyak yung bata. Why is this happening? And he was holding a paper, no? And he said, put it down. He put it down and said, in this kind of situation, I don't have words. Maybe we just learn how to cry, how to weep, and weep with the people. And that was very, very touching, very touching. So he's capable of pronouncing powerful prophetic words, but he also knows the value of silence, the sympathetic silence with those who mourn. Pero nakakalungkot nga, the moment he turned his back, eto na yung candidate na si Duterte, sabi niya, nagmura siya. Oh, umuwi ka na dyan, huwag kang babalik dito. Kasi puro traffic lang ginawa mo dito. And I present this in my PowerPoint. The message of Pope Francis then was mercy and compassion. And immediately, the whole country was brainwashed into violence. Para bang from Osana, it is sa Palm Sunday, to mamatay ka na sa, mga ganyan, ano? It really hurts. It really hurts. To be honest, we tried to reach out to him, saying, "Can you say a public prayer for the Philippines?" Anyway, there was a lot of people who were killed in the disaster in Yolanda, but this is also a disaster, a massacre, as a matter of fact. So we were waiting for that, and formally, some of us, sent letters to him. No, ewan ko, but he probably was busy with other global wars and global disasters na hindi napagbigyan niya. At, baka may ibang mga advice na that make things worse. Ganyan. Hmm. Um, yeah. Hi- sana napagdasal niyo yung Pilipinas in publicly. I know he knew what was happening because when he met Bishop Villegas and Bishop Ambo David, he said, "Oh, I know what's happening in your country. You keep doing what you're doing." So he affirmed the prophetic voices of some of these church leaders who were more vocal against the violation of human rights in the Philippines. Um, Siguro ang pagkukulang namin ay yung hindi namin talaga sapat na naituturo yung mga tinuturo ni Pope Francis. Ah, so many people don't know Laudato Si. They have not heard of Fratelli Tutti. They associate it with Tutti Frutti, mga ganyan. So I think now that we have shown love for him as a person, I think the next thing to do is to really show love for him by echoing again and again in real communicative action what the substance and spirit of his very important prophetic teaching for today. Mm.
Parang Bert, he might not have publicly weighed in, no, on the Philippines' domestic situation. And I know that there were also hopes that he would weigh in on other things in other countries as well, no? Um, but his teachings that you mentioned, what is the role of that in helping form or inform a national and a global conscience? Because now that he's passed away, a lot of people are pointing out that he was very much a moral compass, a rare moral compass in a world that was getting increasingly populist, increasingly intolerant of other views, increasingly violent. He weighed in a lot on Gaza and also what it tell us about forming a national and global conscience.
I'll summarize it by saying um, we need a faith-based political education. And I don't shy away from the word political because actually in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, he speaks about political love, political charity, more than humanitarian, social welfare, uh, personal, face-to-face, individual helping. He speaks about political charity, which involves getting engaged in macro issues from politics to economics to market and the new technologies. And so when we speak about these things, we are accused of, being activists, we're gonna, Marxist or communist. No, to be honest, sinasabi ko nga, we don't need to be communist to be speaking this way. The church has a long tradition of defending human rights, etc. No? So what we need really is communication. Solid social prophetic communication. Tapos yung mga homilies namin parang awa na mananit. Hindi lang yung magpapatawa ka, magpapa-cute yung pare, ay gano'n. We need, ulitin ko, a faith-based, hindi lang basta ideology-based, faith-based political education. We should know that the Christians are human beings who are also citizens, who are also fellow creatures together with plants and animals and the winds and the earth. And and we need to form organizations, we need to form governments, we need to have laws, we need to have rights, we need to have duties, we need economics, we need to build institutions, we have to fight those who are corrupt, and even be without the elections pa. Oh, we need to know what why we should have government and what is government. Why are there divisions of powers in the government? What are the duties and the rights of citizens? In ganon. And all these things are based on the Christian mission in the real world. Yan. Pag wala yan, at babanggit ka ng mga bagay na to sa panahon ng mga eleksyon, nagiging sinasabi, partisan. Ay, yung mga pare nakikialam sa politika. Mali. So, di ba makaawa ako? Pero, request ko rin sa mga media people, ang galing nyo magsulat, ang galing nyo para bang nanood lang kayo, may nasasabi na agad kayo Magbasa lang kayo konti. Naipapahayag ninyo yung mga bagay na mas madaling maintindihan. So, pwede ba pagtulungan natin those who specialize in content and principles and actions and doctrine, please partner with those who have better equipment in popularizing complex identity, complex ideas, and also making use of the new technologies, communication technologies, no? Pwede ba? Ito siguro yung task natin. And by the way, Pope Francis has a book on artificial intelligence and technology. But maybe the new Pope will have to have an encyclical on the new technologies.
You know, on that topic, parang Bert, I'm very moved by one of the things that Pope Francis said about journalism, which is, iko-quote ko, I'm gonna pull it up. Your mission is to explain the world, make it less obscure, make those who live in it less afraid of it, and look at others with greater awareness. It's not an easy mission. It's complicated to think, meditate, study more deeply, to stop and collect ideas and study the context
Hmm.
and precedents of a piece of news. And he said that some of the things that characterize good journalism is to listen, investigate, and report. And I felt that it was so apt, no? Especially now with the journalism facing a crisis of truth and a crisis of interest as well. Mababa talaga ang trust sa news sa ngayon, as we know, no? Parang but how would you characterize Pope Francis's communication style? What can we learn from that? Yeah. Go on.
Natutuwa ko yan. Ang sabi nga, yung mga journalist, kayo yung mga influencer di Dio. Influencers of God. Galing no? Pero gusto ko pa rin dagdagan. Kasi, related to that, he also spoke to the World Federation of Social Movements, Assembly of Social Movements. Sabi niya, Dear social poets. Ganon. Sabi niya, repeat, I call you social poets because you are not just communicators, you're advocates. You're not just advocates, but you're creators of hope in the midst of a world where there's so much mess and devastation. Somehow, you don't remain in the description of what is there. You describe also what is possible through your imagination. Ganda. Now, this is especially for you, Regine. Kasi you're not just a journalist, you're also a poet. Oh. Yeah, that is you are in a dangerous position and a privileged, challenging position because not all journalists are poets. Some are very good in describing what is happening, but to be a journalist and to be a poet, to describe what you observe and to create spaces in the minds through your words on what is still possible in the midst of the seemingly impossible situation. Wow. In other words, you are called to be a prophet. Because some journalists are just journalists or some siguro journalists are lawyers or economists, etc. But some journalists are also poets. And if you combine the two, you become a prophet.
What a way of putting that, parang Bert. But as you know, the world right now, especially with disinformation, especially with AI, is full of false prophets. Yeah, it's so full of false prophets, and a lot of people willingly follow these false prophets because they say what they want to hear. And a prophet or, like a messenger, sometimes they say things or have to say things that the public does not want to hear. What is Pope Francis's approach to that? How would you characterize his communication style?
Ang napansin ko, ginagawa niya, he does not, engage in just attack. Yung iba kasi, when you identify a false prophet, you attack the false prophet. Pero sabi ko nga, sinasabi ko doon sa mga kaibigan ko, ay pagka nagmumura sila, magmumura ka rin, pareho na kayo mumurahin. O, di ba? Pareho na kayo mumurahin. So, si Pope Francis, ang ginagawa niya, una, he keeps on smiling. So, he adds some humor. He adds some humor. And little acts of gentle gestures. Tapik. Ganyan, ano? Tapik, yakap, etc. Tinuturo din niya sa kanyang mga encyclicals. Kahit na sa Laudato Si, sabi niya, okay, we talk about ozone layer, we talk about the ocean, the pollution, etc. But what can you do? Well, before you eat, you say a prayer. And prayer before meals. Because the prayer before meals blesses the food. And as you bless the food, you remind yourself that it came from the work of human hands and the nourishment that comes from the earth. Yung little gestures like that can be very, very revolutionary, sabi niya. Tapos yung the value of silence. Yung iba kasi, when you attack a false prophet, you become equally worthy. No? Not worthy, but worthy. Para bang madami silang sinasabi, ikaw din, banat ka rin ng banat. So, doble na ang ingay. Doble na ang ingay. So, iba yung sa kanya. Magbibigay siya ng mga maliliit na quote, no? Tapos, no, mapapaisip ka. Halimbawa, kinauso niya yung throwaway culture. Throwaway culture, yeah. Because we have so much waste. We waste a lot of food, we waste a lot of gadgets and machines. We dump them into the sea and on the earth. And sometimes you also throw human beings like garbage. Wow. It can also be a throwaway culture. Culture of consumerism. Pero instead of saying culture of consumerism and materialism and secularism, let's say when you throw away culture. Oh, wow. And he repeats this, both in Laudato Si and at the same time in Fratelli Tutti. Sa Laudato Si, throwaway culture, dami nating basura sa lipunan, pero sa Fratelli Tutti, pati mga tao, ginagawa nating basura. Yun. So, ako naman, dinadagdag ko, sinasabi ko nga, ang basura ng lipunan ay nanggagaling sa basura ng kalooban. So, so dapat maglinis ng lipunan, pero maglinis din ng kalooban. Kaya nga yung isa sa mga huli niyang sinulat, alam mo, yung Dilexit Nost, ano yan, He loved us. Ito yung encyclical niya on the Sacred Heart, yung sa banal at dakilang loob ni Jesus. Kailangan kasi, habang nag-uusap tayo ng mga political issues, economic issues, ecological issues, we also need to attend to the inner mysticism of the prophet. Prophet has to be a mystic as well.
He was really a pope of sound bites, I think. And some journalists on the Vatican press corps would probably say that, no? But his critics on the left would say na Pope Francis didn't do enough to change things. Whereas his critics on the right would say that he did and he changed too much naman. How do we reconcile these two views of Pope Francis?
He is in the right Aristotelian middle.
That
Sasabihin ko dun sa left, he did not do much or not enough. Sasabihin ko, look who's talking. Who's talking after 5 decades of revolutionary work. There's also blood in the hands. So, siyempre, gano'n naman talaga. Ang nakakatuwa lang, si Pope Francis, alam niya na may limitation eh. Hindi niya kayang baguhin lahat eh. No? Lalong-lalo na sa ganyang level. Lalo na sa ganyang klaseng level. Na bawat salita mo, i-apply sa iba-ibang sitwasyon, lagi kang madi-decontextualize eh. Pero, halimbawa, yung iba ang gusto, dapat sa panahon ni Pope Francis, dapat na-ordain na yung mga babae. Diba? Kung hindi mo-ordain yung babae, kulang yung ginawa niya. Pero, come to think of it, sa ngayon, siguro hindi pa kaya. Pero sabi niya, ituloy niya yung research. Okay? Pangalawa, ang ginawa niya, naglagay siya ng babae doon sa screening committee of those who are candidates for becoming bishops. Naglagay siya ng babae doon sa screening committee na nag-a-approve kung sino magiging bishops. O diba? Nakakaisip siya ng ibang paraan. Tapos doon mayroong dicastery dito na ang head ay babae. Siguro tinignan niya, kailangan ba talagang cardinal na lalaki ang head? Pwede naman pala hindi. Ito, naglagay siya ng madre. Tapos doon sa Synod on Synodality, ang laki ng papel ng mga kababayan doon. Meron ding mga lay women Filipino theologians na involved. So kung saan pwedeng may magawa. Ngayon, doon sa LGBT, siyempre talagang complex naman yan kahit sa Pilipinas nga, yung Sochi Bill, pinagdidebatehan yan. Lalo na sa global issue na iba naman yung kultura sa Africa, iba yung kultura sa Latin America. Sa Latin America, yung sa Brazil, di ba kung ano yung mga festival, yung carnival nila doon. Sa Africa naman, hindi, walang gay dito. Pero umpisang-umpisa pa lang, in-interview siya, paano yung mga gay? Sabi niya, who am I to judge? Siyempre, yung ibang mga right-wing, masyadong conservative, sabi, hindi, dapat sinabin mo, Adam and Eve lang, walang Steve, o ano. Pero sabi niya, who am I to judge? So, somehow, he finds a way through unofficial statements, but statements that carry the weight of the words of a Pope, di ba?
yes.
So, dahil Pope siya, kahit na yung medyo pabiro, malakas ang dati. Pero hindi pa rin niya binabi yung canon law, di ba? Ganun eh. So he's creating spaces. Hopefully, we hope that later on, we can find other ways of connecting with those who previously were not connected to us. Kanina, nakatanggap ako ng text message galing sa isang kaibigan Muslim. Naiyak daw siya nung nakita niyang namatay si Pope Francis. Oo. Tapos yung isa naman, sabi niya, ako lapsed Catholic eh. Pero I don't know, why am I crying? Mga ganun. Tapos nung shinare ko yun sa iba, ang dami nag-affirm. I can align myself with that.
It's true talaga parang Bert. I think it says a lot about his character that maraming nagka-come out nga na hindi naman sa Catholic community, who didn't grow up Catholic or who are lapsed Catholics, but they have a lot to say in kind about Pope Francis, no? Yung nabanggit niyo po about LGBTQ, I think one informative point there was think piece by Father James Martin, who's also a Jesuit based in the US, who does LGBTQ ministry. And yeah, and one of the things that he said was Pope Francis was very open, and people don't know that he was actually meeting a lot of trans Catholics toward the end very regularly. But he also didn't want to make a very quick shift because he didn't want, quote and unquote, to provoke a chain reaction in other countries in opposition to LGBTQ in some places more severe. So he wanted to go, quote unquote, step by step because he didn't want a sudden change to backfire and more people to be alienated in the process, no? Um I think people don't really realize that Pope Francis was also in some ways he tried to be a strategic thinker as well. And right, what he wanted to do is open up cases, even though malayo pa yung kailangan itatahak na in terms of law or in terms of the official judging, no? Um, and that's kind of a lost art, don't you think, paring Bert? That to go back to a middle, to go back to a space where we can communicate and all see each other as human beings with dignity. Because it seems in a very polarized world today, people just don't want to sit at a table with people who view things differently as them. No?
Sure. So, I like the word, lost art, because this is an art of compassionate art, um, of creating spaces. Yung iba kasi, the, we have a tendency to draw lines. But there is a challenge also to create spaces. I think and that's why we need art. We need the imagination. Oo. Kasi nga nakakatuwa yung yung imagination kasi we're not limited to what is empirically given. Because to be human is to find possibilities. Lalo-lalo na, especially if you are babad, immersed in the real situation. Para bang sinasabi na, come on. Sa pamilya niyo ba walang gay? Di ba?
Mm-hmm.
Alam mo, nalulungkot ako eh. There was one time when our family, went to church, the bigger family, went to church, and the priest, in fiery language, spoke against yung mga gays and ganyan. You know, I saw one of my relatives just slowly step back outside of the church. And of all the issues in the world, Silvio, as- uh, have we spoken prophetically against the killings in the same way that you are fiery, in your wording of your homily against, people who are still in need of understanding? Uh, Ating fair eh. And napaka-delicate nito. Hindi naman dapat yung wishy-washy ka lang gano'n. Iba-iba naman yun, eh. Iba yung platform, no? Ah, nalulungkot ako dun sa mga ganyan. Now, sinasabi mo na, creating spaces and finding the right words, prophetic but also artistic in a way, and meaning words that connect, words that challenge but empowers as well. Uh, it's also strategic in the sense that while you create the space for the marginalized in the mainstream, you also respect the right of some people to have peace of mind in what they have been used to. Ganon, ano? They also have kabang, the right to be affirmed of what they've been struggling to maintain, to be faithful in, no? So it's also a right. It's also a right, and we need, and I think he also respects that. Now, ang importante siguro dito, yung sinasabi nga niya na go out and experience the world. Be bruised, get hurt, get dirty if necessary. Sabi niya, I prefer a church that goes out and in going out suffers some bruises, some dirt, rather than a church that is anemic, bloodless. uh, Anemic, maputla, because it, it it tries to be a church that is overprotected, self-referential, self-protective, too much protective of its own privilege in society. Sabi ng iba, alam mo, ang Catholic Church, nangihina na, hindi na ganun ka-powerful. Maybe we need that. Maybe we need a certain dose of weakness and powerlessness, so that at the end of the day, we rely on the consolation of the spirit, not on the established powers of marble temples and ornate robes that smack of power in society. Maybe we need a certain kind of cleansing like that. Yeah. I think then the gospel will really shine as it is, uh, in its true splendor.
And that it can also be a very humbling experience as well, no, for an institution as powerful as the Catholic Church.
And maybe we need that. We need that. Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the lost art of communication and how Pope Francis has pushed people to kind of meet in the middle, no? One common question I think that a lot of people around the world have with various social issues is some kind of false equivalence when it comes to conflict with other people. For example, what about those who were killed by drug addicts sa case ng Pilipinas, 'di ba? Parang paano naman yung victims ng mga addict na mga criminal sa case ng US? Paano naman ang victims nitong mga immigrants, gano'n? Paano naman kami, yung original people who live here, so to speak? And there's this kind of like false equivalence of pitting two groups of people, no, against each other. And there is, I think, a teaching that can sort of answer kung bakit ganito yung philosophy ng figures like Pope Francis, which is yung preferential option for the poor, the preferential option for people who are marginalized. Um, this is something na in-embody ni Pope Francis, but could you maybe tell us what this is, what it means, and what it means now sa current context ng politics natin?
Actually, yung preferential option for the poor It's not original with, Pope Francis. Actually, hindi mas sinasabi niya, yung marginalized, migrants, refugees, etc. No? Uh, Actually, the preferential option for the poor dates back to Jesus Christ. He said, the good shepherd, somehow being confident of the good status of the 99, would go out of his way to search for the lost sheep, those who are the disqualified, the person or the group of persons who have no credentials, marginalized. They they are not qualified for scholarships. Mga ganyan, ano. They're not invited to be speakers in conferences. Go out, reach out to them. Those who are marginalized, disqualified, lacking credentials, etc. So it goes back to Jesus Christ. But the respect for human dignity is for all. Kung may victims, for example, ang drug addict na nakapang-rape, then by all means, no? By all means, we need to protect. Katulad ng ginagawa rin ni Pope Francis, he really faced the issue of sexual abuse, especially of minors committed by the clergy. He had the audacity, the courage, probably not 100%, but he had the courage and the audacity to face this. As a matter of fact, now we have institutionalized what you call safeguarding. No? Pero parang PhD in safeguarding yun eh, dito sa Gregorian University. Now, in other words, wherever there are victims, we should be there. So, walang ganon na isang mamimili ka lang ng biktima. Hindi. Kaya lang, merong mas mabigat yung victimization. Kung mas malaki yung mga missiles nitong isang bansa na to, mas marami talaga siyang mapapatay sa kapila. So, in the meantime na in the meantime na as you castigate the more dominant powers, no? You also have to protect the weaker ones. Now, my image here is something like this. No? Halimbawa, if you're a parent and you have two kids fighting, what do you do? Like, of course, you have to go to the middle. You go in between. Tama. Pero that doesn't mean you're neutral. Anong gagawin ng magulang? Yayakapin niya yung maliit o kung sino man yung naapi. Tapos pipigilan niya yung malakas. You're in between, but you make sure you embrace the weaker one even as you appeal to the humanity of the stronger one. You're in the middle, but you're not exactly neutral. To highlight also one effect of this drug war, which is excessive bloating of our prison cells. They are also victims of this drug war. And Pope Francis, when he recuperated, first thing he did during last yung Holy Week, he visited the prison. Ganun din yung when he became a Pope, he visited the prisons. So we should pay attention to those who are killed, to those who are thrown into forced rehabilitation, and some of them are inhuman in their retreatment. Those who are not killed, but they are tortured by excessive sentences, life and double life sentences on because of some grams. And finally, the whole society is really victimized. And that's why in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis tells us, you cannot say you're a Christian and yet not meddle into politics. To be a good Catholic, you have to meddle in politics because politics is necessary in fixing what is wrong in society. And if you don't do that, you just end up in dole out. You just continue all this humanitarian social welfare work, which should be temporary. Our real task is to put order in society with moral principles, with compassion and mercy, but also always with justice.
I'm glad you mentioned, parang Bert, that one of Pope Francis's last visits was to the prison cell
Yes.
because
Yes.
it's an important virtue signal, I think, that everyone has dignity and that there are also a diversity of victims of social issues in the world, no? That it's not just one or another, as you said, who is a victim, but everyone, no?
We're focused on those who are killed. That's correct. But there are other forms of victimization. Mm.
Mm-hmm. And siguro as a last question, parang Bert, what is the role that the church will play um in the national for the Philippines and global conscience in the post Francis years?
Well, as I said, we have a rich tradition of social teachings. That means when Jesus said in the beginning of his ministry, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, to bring freedom and liberation to captive, to make those who are blind see again, and to make sure that the good news is preached to the poor." That remains our mission. That remains our mission. Stick to the spirit of the gospel and apply the wisdom of the church tradition, especially calling from the wisdom of Vatican II and the encyclicals. And that would be very, very, very important. Now, as I said, we need to be prophetic, but prophets will also have to be mystics, meaning our activism should come from mysticism, a deep relationship, spiritual relationship with the Lord, and this mysticism flows and overflows into action and communicative action and active communication in the real world. No? Hmm. So, ganun siguro. Just stick to the real richness of the message of the good news. Mm. Wag lang yung wag yung limit lang. Wag lang yung puro activism na walang spirituality. Wag lang yung puro spirituality, liturgical, yung rituals without getting involved in society. Parang ganito, no? Parang bang, yung iba, ang gusto lang paganda yung simbahan, gagawa ng malaking simbahan, tapos sa labas, wala palang parking lot. So we become a source of traffic in society. We have good singing in the church, we have a good architecture, but without realizing it, we forget about space. Forget about we live in society, we occupy space. There are cars of the parishioners, and they become sources of traffic in society. So if we're not sensitive, we can have beautiful singing and liturgies, which we need. I need that. But at the same time, we need to pay attention that we live not in a vacuum, but in the midst of society, which now is bloody, marred by consumerism, materialism, even fascism, on top of populism.
And Pope Francis, parang Bert, has hopefully, and I think we can say, it's safe to say that he has demonstrated a template for how regular people can navigate this world. Parang Bert, thank you so much for the time that you spent with us today. Everyone, this was Father Albert Alejo of the Society of Jesus. And this is Regine Cabato for Teka Teka News.